Welcome to History Crossroads, where past meets present, and every story reveals a new path through time. June 1944. The island of Saipan in the Pacific is a battlefield of chaos and carnage. U.S. Marines are locked in brutal combat with Japanese forces entrenched in caves and bunkers. Amid the horrors of the war, one unlikely hero, armed not with weapons, but with words, emerges to save over 1,300 lives. His name, Guy Gabaldon. This is the story of a boy from East Los Angeles, raised by a Japanese American family, who became one of the most extraordinary and unsung heroes of World War II. Welcome to History Crossroads, where we uncover the hidden stories of history and the people who shaped our world. Guy Gabaldon was born on March 22, 1926, in East Los Angeles, California, the sixth of seven children in a large Mexican American family. Growing up during the Great Depression, life was tough for young Guy. His parents, hardworking immigrants, struggled to provide for their children in a city where poverty and social challenges were common. When Guy was just 12 years old, his life took a devastating turn. Both of his parents passed away, leaving him orphaned at a tender age. Faced with an uncertain future, Guy moved in with his older brothers, but he quickly found himself drifting. He was small for his age and often got into trouble on the streets of Los Angeles. However, his life took an unexpected and transformative turn when he was invited to stay with the Nakano family, close friends of his parents. The Nakanos were Japanese Americans living in the Boyle Heights neighborhood, and they offered Guy not just a place to stay, but a sense of belonging and stability he desperately needed. The Nakanos became more than just his guardians. They became his second family. They welcomed him into their home with warmth and kindness, treating him as one of their own. Guy learned to speak Japanese fluently, practicing daily conversations with the Nakanos. He picked up their customs, like bowing as a sign of respect, and came to understand the cultural importance of honor, humility, and loyalty. He later said that his time with the Nakanos gave him a deep appreciation for Japanese culture and a unique perspective on life. But the Nakano family's impact on Guy went beyond language and culture. They instilled in him a strong moral compass and a belief in the value of understanding others, even those who might be seen as enemies. Guy would often credit them for shaping his outlook on life and giving him the tools that would later define his heroism during the war. However, as Guy flourished in the Nakano household, the world around them grew darker. In 1942, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which authorized the forced relocation and incarceration of Japanese American in internment camps. Overnight, families like the Nakanos were stripped of their homes, businesses, and dignity. The Nakanos were sent to a camp, and Guy was left on his own once again. This injustice deeply affected Guy. The family that had cared for him and taught him so much about honor and loyalty was now treated as enemies simply because of their heritage. He never forgot what the Nakanos endured, and it fueled his resolve to make a difference when his time came. As Guy grew older, he developed a fiery determination to prove himself. In 1943, at the age of 17, he enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps. He was eager to serve his country and contribute to the fight against fascism. But for Guy, this wasn't just about patriotism. It was personal. The war had robbed the Nakanos of their freedom, and Guy saw his service as a way to honor them and fight for a better future. Little did anyone know, this boy from East Los Angeles, who had spent years straddling two cultures, would soon become one of the most remarkable and unsung heroes of World War II. In 1943, with the world at war, 17-year-old Guy Gabaldon made a bold decision to join the U.S. Marine Corps. Though still technically a minor, Guy was determined to enlist and fight for his country. He convinced a relative to sign the necessary papers, officially allowing him to join the ranks of one of the toughest military branches. Guy's decision to enlist was deeply personal. He wasn't just fighting against the Axis powers, he was fighting for the values instilled in him by the Nakano family. While the Nakanos and thousands of other Japanese Americans were being held in internment camps, Guy saw this as a service as a way to prove that Japanese culture and heritage were not the enemy. After enlisting, Guy completed basic training at the Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego. Known for his small stature but big personality, he quickly earned a reputation as a scrappy and resourceful Marine. His fluent Japanese caught the attention of his superiors, and as he was assigned to language school at Camp Elliott, there he honed his linguistic skills, learning not just conversational Japanese, but also military phrases and dialects that would later prove invaluable on the battlefield. By 1944, Guy was deployed to the Pacific Theater as part of the 2nd Marine Division. His unit was headed for Saipan, a strategic island in the Mariana Islands chain. The battle for Saipan would become one of the bloodiest and most critical campaigns in the Pacific. The island was a vital stepping stone for the Allies. It would serve as a base for launching attacks on Japan itself. However, capturing Saipan was no easy task. The Japanese Imperial Army, numbering around 30,000 troops, had fortified the island with bunkers, caves, and tunnels. Their orders were clear: fight to the death and take as many Allied lives as possible. For the Japanese, surrender was not an option. It was seen as a deep dishonor, worse than death. Adding to the complexity were the tens of thousands of Japanese civilians living on the island. Many had been indoctrinated with propaganda, believing that the Americans were barbaric and would kill or torture them if captured. Amid this grim and chaotic backdrop, the U.S. Marines landed on Saipan on June 15, 1944. The initial assault was brutal. The beaches were heavily defended and casualties were high. Guy's unit fought through intense resistance as they pushed inland. Despite the carnage around him, Guy saw an opportunity to use his unique skills. He realized that his knowledge of Japanese language and culture could turn the tide, not just for the Marines, but for the Japanese soldiers and civilians trapped on the island. Initially, Guy's superiors were skeptical. Sneaking behind enemy lines to speak with Japanese seemed like a fool's errand, if not outright suicidal. But Guy was persistent. He argued that he could save lives on both sides by convincing the enemy to surrender. Finally, his commanding officers gave him permission to try. On his very first mission, Guy's strategy was as bold as it was unorthodox. Armed with only a captured Japanese rifle for appearances, he moved stealthily through the jungle toward a cave reported to be occupied by enemy forces. He knew this was no ordinary battle. Japanese soldiers were trained to view surrender as dishonorable, and many were willing to die rather than give up. Guy also understood the propaganda the civilians had been fed, which portrayed Americans as monsters who would show no mercy. It was against this backdrop of fear and resistance that Guy set out. Approaching the cave entrance under the cover of darkness, Guy called out in fluent Japanese, "Come out with your hands up. You are surrounded by American forces. We will treat you with dignity and you will not be harmed. You have fought bravely, but there is no need for further bloodshed. Save yourselves and your families." At first, there was silence. Guy waited, heart pounding, unsure if his words had been heard or if an ambush was imminent. Minutes passed, and then movement. Slowly, a single Japanese soldier emerged from the cave, weapon raised but trembling. Behind him came another, and then another. By the end of the night, 15 soldiers had laid down their arms, surrendering to the young Marine who had risked his life to talk them into peace. But Guy's greatest success came weeks later, during the final phase of the Saipan campaign. By this time, Japanese soldiers and civilians were retreating into vast cave systems near the island's cliffs. Guy had learned from captured prisoners that a single cave housed 800 people, men, women, and children, who were too terrified to surrender. Their fear was understandable. Japanese propaganda had convinced them that American forces would torture or kill anyone who gave themselves up. Guy decided to act. Armed only with his voice and his deep understanding of Japanese culture, he approached the cave and called out, "Everyone inside, listen to me. You are surrounded by American forces. Fighting is useless. You come out now, I promise you will be treated with respect. You will not be harmed. This war is over for you." There was no response. But Guy wasn't deterred. He appealed to their humanity, raising his voice again. "I know you are scared, but I give you my word as a soldier. We have food and water waiting for you. Your children deserve to live. Do not throw away your lives." Slowly, a few civilians began to emerge, women clutching children, elderly men helping each other walk. Guy encouraged them, speaking gently, reassuring them of their safety. As more people came out, he continued his appeals, using his knowledge of Japanese honor codes to convince even the soldiers inside to lay down their weapons. By the end of the day, over 800 people, soldiers and civilians alike, had surrendered peacefully. It was an act of courage and compassion that saved lives on both sides of the conflict. This remarkable feat cemented Guy Gabaldon's reputation as the Pied Piper of Saipan. His ability to connect with the enemy, to break through the fear and propaganda, and to inspire surrender without violence remains one of the most extraordinary stories of World War II. Guy Gabaldon's actions on Saipan were unprecedented. While his fellow Marines were locked in bloody combat, Guy was achieving victories of a different kind. He wasn't just fighting the enemy, he was saving them. His methods, unorthodox as they were, changed the course of the battle and brought an unexpected humanity to one of the war's most brutal campaigns. One of Guy's most harrowing missions occurred late in the Saipan campaign. By this time, Japanese forces were dwindling, and many had retreated into heavily fortified positions within the island's network of caves. For the Japanese soldiers, these caves were last stands, fortresses where they could hold off the Americans or die trying. But they weren't the only ones sheltering there. Alongside them were terrified civilians, many of who had been forced into these caves or had chosen them as refuges of desperation. For these civilians, surrender was unthinkable, and death seemed inevitable. Guy learned of one such cave where a significant group of Japanese soldiers and civilians were trapped. The Marines were preparing to attack the position, knowing that the engagement would likely be a bloodbath. Guy, however, had other plans. He convinced his commanding officers to let him try his approach first. Alone and unarmed, he made his way to the cave entrance. As he approached, Guy could feel the tension in the air. The slightest sound, an accidental rustle of the leaves, or the crunch of his boots on the rocky ground, might have alerted the soldiers inside, who were ready to fire at any perceived threat. When he reached the mouth of the cave, he stood still for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Then he called out in Japanese, "Listen to me. I know you are scared, but there is no reason to fight anymore. You have fought bravely, but there is no need to die. Come out peacefully, and you will be treated with respect." The response was immediate: gunfire. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks near him, and Guy dove for cover. He waited for the shots to subside, his heart racing. Then, to the astonishment of anyone who might have been watching, he stood up and called out again, "I promise you will not be harmed. Do not waste your lives. Come out and surrender." Inside the cave, confusion reigned. Some soldiers wanted to keep fighting, but others, exhausted, starving, and desperate, began to listen. Guy could hear voices arguing, and he pressed his advantage. "You have my word. I will take you to safety. Your families need you alive." After what felt like an eternity, a single soldier emerged, His rifle was slung over his shoulder, and his hands were raised in surrender. Guy nodded to him, speaking calmly and encouragingly, and the man gestured for the others to follow. Slowly, more soldiers and civilians began to emerge. By the end of the mission, Guy had convinced over 100 people to surrender peacefully. Time and again, Guy repeated this process. Some missions were smaller, convincing a few dozen people to lay down their arms, but others were astonishing in scale, like the rescue of over 800 civilians and soldiers from a single cave. In total, he persuaded over 1,300 people to surrender during the Saipan campaign. It wasn't just the sheer number of lives he saved that was extraordinary. It was the fact that he had achieved this without firing a single shot. Guy's methods relied on his unique understanding of Japanese culture and values. He knew how deeply ingrained the concept of honor was in Japanese society, and he used this to his advantage. He framed the surrender not as a betrayal, but as a courageous act of survival, a choice that would allow soldiers to return to their families and rebuild their lives. He also knew how to dispel the fears created by Japanese propaganda, which painted the Americans as ruthless barbarians. By speaking their language, not just linguistically, but emotionally, Guy broke through barriers of fear and mistrust that no weapon could breach. Despite his success, Guy's missions were not without risk. On more than one occasion, he found himself in life threatening situations. During one mission, he was ambushed by a group of Japanese soldiers who initially pretended to surrender. As they raised their weapons to fire, Guy acted quickly, shouting commands in Japanese to confuse them and diving for cover. Somehow he escaped unharmed, but the incident was a sobering reminder of how dangerous his work was. Yet Guy never wavered. For him, the possibility of saving lives was always worth the risk. Guy's actions on Saipan weren't just acts of heroism, they were acts of humanity. In the middle of a war defined by destruction and death, he chose a path of compassion. He saw his enemies not as faceless adversaries, but as people, people who were scared, hungry, and desperate to survive. And in doing so, he reminded the world of what it means to truly be brave. By the end of the Battle of Saipan, Guy Gabaldon had accomplished what no one thought possible. His courage, linguistic skills, and deep understanding of Japanese culture had allowed him to persuade over 1,300 Japanese soldiers and civilians to surrender, an achievement unmatched by any individual in the Pacific theater. But as the war continued, Guy's story was nearly lost amidst the chaos of history. After the battle, Guy's actions were recognized by his fellow Marines, many of whom who had witnessed his extraordinary missions firsthand. They were amazed by his ability to achieve with words what others could only dream of achieving with firepower. However, military bureaucracy didn't initially give him the recognition he deserved. Guy was awarded the Silver Star for his bravery, a significant honor, but one many felt was insufficient for his remarkable achievements. In fact, several of his commanding officers lobbied for him to receive the Medal of Honor, the highest award for military valor in the United States. Unfortunately, their requests were denied. Following the war, Guy returned to civilian life, but adjusting wasn't easy. Like many veterans, he struggled with the transition from the intensity of the battlefield to the quiet routines of ordinary life. For a time, he drifted, working a series of odd jobs. Eventually, he found a sense of purpose in Alaska, where he became a fisherman and raised a family. Despite his wartime heroics, Guy largely stayed out of the spotlight, preferring a simple life. In 1960, Hollywood took an interest in Guy's story. A film titled Hell to Eternity was released, loosely based on his life. The movie dramatized Guy's childhood and his actions on Saipan, but took significant liberties with the facts. While the film brought some attention to his story, It didn't capture the full depth of his bravery or his unique cultural background. Guy himself expressed mixed feelings about the movie, appreciating the recognition but lamenting the inaccuracies. Years later, Guy's actions during the war began to receive renewed attention. His Silver Star was upgraded to the Navy Cross, one of the military's highest honors, in recognition of the scale and significance of his achievements. Historians and veterans groups highlighted his story as an example of the power of compassion and the understanding in the midst of war. Guy gave interviews, spoke at schools, and became an advocate for the contributions of Mexican American and Japanese American communities to the war effort. Despite this recognition, Guy's story remains relatively unknown to the general public, a fact that reflects the often overlooked contributions of individuals who didn't fit the traditional mold of wartime heroism. Guy wasn't a general commanding vast armies or a pilot flying daring missions. He was a young Marine, barely out of his teens, who used his voice and his empathy to make a difference. His story challenges the conventional narratives of war, reminding us that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a gun, but an understanding heart. Guy Gabaldon passed away on August 31st, 2006, at the age of 80. He left behind a legacy of courage, humanity, and enduring belief in the value of life, friend or foe. His actions on Saipan saved over 1,000 lives, but they also left a lasting lesson for the world that even in the darkest of times, one person's compassion can illuminate a path to hope. Guy Gabaldon's story is one of incredible bravery and compassion, but it is also a reminder of the countless unsung heroes who shaped the course of history. How many more stories like his remain untold? How many lives were saved or changed by those who chose to see humanity in the face of their enemies? At History Crossroads, we believe these stories deserve to be heard. If you've been inspired by Guy Gabaldon's journey, subscribe to our podcast to uncover more hidden chapters of history. Together, let's honor the courage, sacrifice, and humanity of those who came before us. Until next time, reflect on the lessons of the past and the extraordinary individuals who made them possible. Thank you for listening.